Hello and welcome to today's webinar where we will be discussing implementing robust chemical management systems within the leather supply chain. By means of introduction, my name is Georgina Moore and I'm Head of ChemAP Consulting at Eurofins plc. My role within Eurofins is really around supporting the leather supply chain with the implementation of chemical management. So that could be through testing regimes, audit protocols, global compliance and support, and also verified systems such as our CHEMAT program for MRSL verification. So during today's session, we're going to talk about a few different things. To begin with, we're going to talk about why chemical management is needed. We're also going to address some of the supply chain challenges we see with regards to managing hazardous chemicals. We're going to talk in a fair bit of detail around chemical management audits and what are the key factors to consider when conducting a chemical management audit. We're going to do a little bit of a quick recap on the ZDHC standard for leather and textile sector. I'm going to introduce to you our CHEMAT program. And then there will be options for questions to be submitted, which we can then answer at a later point. Okay, so firstly, I'd want to talk about why chemical management is important. So there's a few different scenarios on the screen, some of which may jump out to you more than others as something that you have considered either individually or as part of your company. But these are really just some examples. There would be many more things that we could add. But we see chemical management as an important factor for considerations such as protection of worker health, protection of consumer health, protection of the environment. And now really through the course of the presentation, I really want you to consider those three elements as being equal considerations. For a long time, we've seen product safety legislation focusing on protecting the consumer. And we can understand why. We want to make sure we're not manufacturing or retailing product that is going to cause our consumer any harm through skin reactions or headaches because of volatile chemicals, those sorts of things. But really what we've started to understand over the last few years as an industry is that it's not all just about the consumer health. Yes, that's very important, but alongside that are equally as important considerations such as more upstream protection. So protection of worker health and safety, making sure the chemicals that the workers are using and handling on a daily basis are not going to cause any adverse harm for them, even if those chemicals don't end up in that finished constructed product. It doesn't mean we could ignore them because they are being used in the manufacturing process. And then the other side of the story is protection of the environment at end of life. What happens to our products when they're disposed of, when they enter landfill? Are there any chemicals contained within that product that when it starts to break down are going to be degraded and released into the environment that could be hazardous or toxic to the environment or aquatic species or something like that? All three considerations are equally as important. And this is why we need robust chemical management systems that consider all elements under a holistic approach. So other things to mention of why chemical management is important would be things around CSR objectives and stakeholder concerns. There's a lot more activity and policing and interest in chemical safety, and we need to be able to have answers and responses to those questions and concerns. We need good systems in order to identify risk. So to understand out of those hundreds of chemicals that are legislated, which ones are a risk for me and my product and my material. We need good systems to gain structure and control in the supply chain. So we're not running around trying to figure out what we need to do. There's good infrastructure in place. So that could be things like testing protocols, specifications, a kind of review periods, etc. And of course, chemical management is important for things like compliance with legislation and providing you access into the markets in which you want to retail. So there's so many reasons why we need to have good systems to manage hazardous chemicals within our supply chain. Now, this here is a very simplistic diagram of what a supply chain could look like. So if we were to do the exercise, let's take a footwear brand. If we were to do the exercise to map their supply chain, what we would see is a general pattern is that as you go up through each of the tiers, there's an increase in size, but there's a reduction in visibility. So with that increased size and reduced visibility, there is heightened risk because there's an element of unknown. And our teams in the sustainability department at Eurofins PLC do a lot of supply chain mapping projects. And they see a typical ratio of about 1 to 10 between tier 1 and tier 3 of the supply chain. Now, with regards to chemical management, there's different needs at those various sections of the supply chain. So if you talk about the brand, they need to have a robust and logical chemical management system, which manages both their suppliers and their materials. And this is more than just having a specification or some test reports. This is an integral part of their quality management system. So it will cover things like, of course, policies, specs, testing regimes, but audit protocols, supplier onboarding, material procurement, training, future-proofing, all these sorts of activities combined in a harmonized chemical management system that works for that brand. It's logical, but it's also robust. And one brand system could look very different to another brand system. That's not an issue. It needs to be relevant to the way that that brand is working, whilst covering the risk suitably. As you move to the middle sections of the supply chain, so this could be material or product manufacturers, so tanneries, footwear factories, etc. They obviously need to understand the brand's requirements and make sure that they can adhere to those and fulfill those requirements. But in the tannery, you also need your own chemical management system, which covers your chemical procurement, or if you're getting incoming materials, how you select and manage suppliers of those materials, what testing is required, what processes are required for you to accept or select suppliers of these chemicals and materials, and then what validation and verification is done for your outgoing product or material that you're making. So it's not just about, yes, we've got a chemical management system because we've got all of our brand specs. It's also, what are you doing? What is your process and policies for managing chemistry? And then as you look to the chemical suppliers, there's now a huge increasing pressure on the chemical industries to manufacture and verify their chemical formulations in accordance with MRSL requirements, so manufacturing restricted substance list requirements. So testing things like fat liquors and dye stuffs and chemical auxiliaries to make sure they do not contain as a formulation any hazardous chemicals above known quantities. So there's various different needs, all harmonized, but slightly different perspectives across the supply chain with regards to managing and working hazardous chemicals out of the chain. So I want to talk about chemical management audits as an integral part of any robust chemical management system. So there's some key considerations that we feel would form a robust CMA. And I'm going to talk predominantly from the perspective of kind of manufacturers here, but it's really the same kind of systems and themes, whether you're a brand, whether you're a tannery, whether you're a chemical formulator. So it's a general advisory slide here, but I'll use some examples more tailored towards manufacturers. So first thing that we would look at is general observations. So is chemical management a board agenda item? How seriously is this business committed to managing hazardous chemicals? Does it play an active role in their systems and procedures and policies and thought processes? How are decisions communicated? Is this manufacturer associated with relevant industry organizations? And a couple listed here as examples being ZDHC or LWG, but of course there's others. But are they actively monitoring or even participating in stakeholder organizations where chemistry is a key topic or theme? So they're keeping abreast of what's going on in the industry. They have a voice around these sorts of concerns. We'd also look at things like access to legal counsel, whether that's available either internally or whether it's outsourced. And of course, in a manufacturing setting, we're going to look at operational permits that are required for the jurisdiction that this company is in and whether they're in place, expired or valid, etc. We'd also look at things like material or chemical procurement. So whether you're buying in chemicals, whether you're buying in semi-processed material, components potentially, what is the process for procuring these? Is there a process? Is it a written, defined process, or is it purely based on supplier relationships or cost? Is there any form of checklist or SOP or protocol that has to be ran in when you're selecting suitability of those materials or chemicals? For example, in chemical procurement, as a tannery, how are these selected? Are the SDSs reviewed? Is there any form of questioning around MRSL testing or conformity? Is that specification of restricted substances shared with the chemical supplier? These are the sorts of things that you would look at in a chemical management audit. If there is an approved list of materials or chemicals, what's the process for creating that list? How are things added? Can things be removed? How is it monitored and policed? And you'd also look at things like communication between sourcing teams and regulatory teams, and how well managed that is, so that the regulatory team isn't doing all of this work for then the sourcing team to just ignore it potentially. And very similar sorts of observations for supplier management. So if you were to start working with a brand new supplier of a chemical or material or a component, what does that look like? Is there an onboarding process where you talk through the specification and your expectations and your requirements? Is there forms for them to fill? Do you look at getting some testing done before you enter into a contract? These sorts of questions. What is the process? Is there a process? Selection of suitability of suppliers. If you are working through subcontractors or third-party agents, making sure that your expectations and requirements are effectively communicated through that third party. And again, we talk about communication between suppliers and regulatory teams. A good chemical management audit would also look at restricted substance policies. It is at the heart of any chemical management system. Does this business, whether it's a brand, whether it's a tannery, whether it's a chemical supplier, do they have a restricted substance policy, a written, controlled policy of restricted substances within their products and materials? And who manages that? How is it maintained? How is it communicated? How is it updated? Because we know that things change routinely. Legislation changes, methods changes, industry focus changes. So the policy has to change to reflect this. So it needs to be a live document. At minimum, we would expect a restricted substance policy to be updated annually. So it's not just in an audit, it's not just checking, do you have a policy? Yes, great. It's all these activities that go with that policy: maintenance, updating, accuracy checks, communication, getting it sent out to all suppliers and getting signed copies back. These sorts of things, not just the fact, yes, you've got one, great, because you could have a policy and it could have never been sent out, and then it's not worth the paper that it's written on. Of course, we would also look at testing. So what testing is being done for hazardous chemicals? Is there a testing plan in place? And this could be MRSL or RSL, so it could be testing of chemicals, it could be testing of leather, could be testing of finished product. But in all of those scenarios, is there a testing plan in place? Is it robust enough? Is enough testing being done? What is the frequency of testing? What is the scope of tests being done? You could have hundreds and hundreds of tests being done, but you've only ever been testing for one thing, as opposed to everything that's in that policy. So scope is really crucial consideration to be made. Is there a policy about failures? So if you get a failed test report, what happens? There should be a process to be followed that specifies who needs to be made aware. It specifies the process for pulling off different batches potentially for retesting. These sorts of triggers that would happen from a failed test report should be formalized in a process or a policy, so that it's not a panic when a failure comes in, and there's a distinct process to follow. You'd also look at things like how testing providers are selected. So are testing providers accredited? Is testing being done in a third-party independent lab and not just always in the business's own lab? Also, in a chemical management audit, we may look at things like training. So is there training being provided to workers on hazardous chemicals, on chemical storage, PPE, disposal, legislation, these sorts of things? We may look at audits. So what other audits are being done that do have a chemical management element to them that could be relevant, and it's further evidence that this company is actively managing their chemicals and participating in these sorts of exercises. And then the last two, future-proofing, MRSL validation. So particularly in a tannery, what steps are being taken to make sure you're up to date and to future-proof your business? We know that the concept of MRSL testing is relatively new, so it's unlikely that all chemicals used in the tannery are MRSL validated, but does the tannery have a roadmap for which point in time they will only be sourcing MRSL validated chemicals, with time points and percentage requirements as you move across that timeline? These are good things to look at. So all of these elements, and this is just a brief snapshot, but all of these elements form what we would consider a robust chemical management audit. So it's much more than just looking at test reports or just looking at a policy. It's around the attitude and the infrastructure and the systems that together create a robust chemical management system. Looking at them in isolation doesn't give you that full picture. So I wanted to quickly just give a recap on ZDHC, because I appreciate maybe not everybody is following their activities. But ZDHC, the Zero Discharge of Hazardous Chemistry Foundation, is a multi-stakeholder organisation that was set up in 2011 and became a legal entity in 2015. And the whole purpose of this organisation is to address the use and discharge of hazardous chemicals in leather, textile, apparel and footwear industries, for worker safety, for consumer safety, for environmental protection. And the ZDHC group, which is, chemical companies, manufacturers, brands, technical organisations such as ourselves, all working together, What they have done is develop an MRSL and a wastewater guideline relevant to the leather and textile industries. It's all open source, so if you are not up to speed with their activities, I would recommend going and looking at those documents. Just again, I recognize that I've been saying RSRLM and MRSL quite a lot through the course of this presentation, but just to reiterate, if anyone is getting confused, the differences between the two. So an RSL is a list of chemicals that must not be present in a finished material or article. So this would be testing that's done on leather, textile, synthetics, or testing done on a bag, a shoe, a clothing, which is really driven by legislation and brand and retail decisions. Whereas an MRSL is to be used further up the supply chain. So this is looking at hazardous substances that could be present in chemical formulations. So it's not just thinking about chemicals contained within a finished product. It's looking at it right from the beginning and looking at chemical formulations and whether these hazardous substances are present there. So I want to briefly introduce you to the CHEMAT program, which is a chemical management system program across the different sectors of the supply chain. And I just want to briefly mention the work that we are doing with the chemical industry and with manufacturers in this space. So if we look back to the overview we had at the beginning of the supply chain, we talked about the different needs of those sectors. What we've done within ChemMap is develop products and services to satisfy those needs. So we have ChemMap protocols for brands, which is predominantly around benchmarking and gap analysis. We have ChemMap program for manufacturers. So this is for material manufacturers, whereby we have chemical management audits and training. And we have ChemMap for chemical formulators, which is MRSL testing and chemical management audits. So this is the ZDHC MRSL in which ChemMap is aligned with. So again, just to ensure we're all at the same level of understanding, ZDHC have created something called a gateway, which is essentially a online platform where chemical formulators can upload their chemical products onto that gateway. And they can be on there at various different levels. So originally there was level 0, which is like a self-declaration, but this has been removed since the end of last year. So now a chemical company can either be a level 1, a level 2, or a level 3 on that gateway. Essentially, without going to huge specifics, the higher the level on the gateway, the more verification has been done for that chemical formulation. The idea being that as a user of chemicals, so as a manufacturer, you can use this gateway as a sourcing tool. So you can look for the chemicals that you need to purchase, you can look on the gateway, and you can see the different levels of conformity achieved from different chemical companies, and you can use this as a sourcing platform. Now within ChemMap, we are able to do the verification work for level 1, level 2, and level 3. So just as, just jump back before I go on to the next slide. As an example, in the level 1, we're looking predominantly at MRSL testing. As we move up to level 3, we're looking at MRSL testing, we're looking at chemical management audits. We also do some raw materials testing. So there's an awful lot of verification work that's done in order for a company to achieve that higher level. Mentioning the work that we're doing with manufacturers. So this could, as I said, could be a tannery, could be a textile mill, could be a footwear factory. But we are doing chemical management audits at that manufacturing facility. So those, the slide we had a few minutes ago that talked about the considerations for a chemical management audit, that's exactly what we're doing. at this facility. And if the facility achieves the minimum required score, then they can be awarded as a CHEMAT approved manufacturer. We also have some online training modules covering various topics such as understanding data sheets, chemical storage and waste management, chemical handling, health and safety, wastewater, those sorts of things. And technicians within the facility can take these different e-learnings. There's an assignment that goes along with them, and upon successful completion of those, then we award a CHEMAT approved technician status. So we have the ability to accredit the entire facility as a CHEMAT approved manufacturer, but on top of that, you can have technicians within the facility being given approved technician status. So just to really to bring this to a close, I don't want to dwell too much on what we're doing in the CHEMAT program, because I want this to be an informative session, but I just wanted to highlight that to you if you're not aware of what we're doing. But thinking back to the considerations slide for that chemical management audit, what I'm really trying to get across to you here is that you need to invest. You need to invest your time, your resources into developing robust systems that are really a holistic approach to managing chemicals. A lot of people are doing pieces of the puzzle. They have a chemical management policy, or they have a restricted substance list or a specification. They're doing routine testing, maybe doing some audits, but then those peripheral activities are missing. The things like having supplier onboarding programs, or having corrective action plans for when you get failures. Sometimes these sorts of things are missing. And when you're so far involved in your own systems, it's hard to spot where there's gaps. And that's why having a chemical management review or audit can help identify where there's weaknesses or where there's gaps. And we can give recommendations and suggestions of how to fill those gaps and provide a roadmap plan for improvement. But it's worth the investment. Ultimately, making sure you have robust, diligent systems means all of these things on the slide here. It means you'll get root cause analysis for when there's failures. It means that you may have cost savings because you're not duplicating testing or doing testing that isn't relevant to your business and your materials. You could come out of it with smoother onboarding of suppliers, or approved supplier lists, or approved manufacturer lists. It's going to help with less chemical failures and therefore compliance with legislation. And thinking back to what we said at the very beginning, consumer safety, worker safety, protection of the environment. They are ultimately the three main pillars of why having a chemical management system is necessary. Okay, so I believe we have the option for some questions to be submitted. So if you do have any questions on this topic, I appreciate it's a really quick introduction into actually quite a huge topic. But if you do have any questions, then please feel free to submit them either via APLF or to myself directly. I'd be happy to answer those or organise some further discussions with anybody if needed. So for now, thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed the session. Bye.